Today on Pilot's Discretion, we're joined by Mark Vanhoenacker, a pilot for a major European airline and a best-selling author. He tells us about flying the Boeing 787, how to stay curious while traveling, and what the best airport is for plane spotting. Pilot's Discretion starts right now. Welcome, pilots. I'm your host, John Zimmerman of Sporties, and thanks for listening. Remember to visit sporties.com/podcast for show links and complete archives, and feel free to drop us a line at podcast@sporties.com. I'm thrilled to have Mark Vanhoenacker on the show today. He is a Boeing 787 pilot for a major European airline, but he's best known for his writing. He is the author of 3 books, including his debut, Skyfaring, which is absolutely one of the best aviation books of all time, in my opinion. His latest book is available now. It's called Imagine a City, A Pilot's Journey Across the Urban World. He's also a regular contributor for the Financial Times and the New York Times. Mark, welcome to Pilot's Discretion.
Thanks, John. It's a pleasure to be here. And, I've been a Sporties reader long before I even had a credit card to order anything. Back when I was a kid, it was my favorite catalog. So it's an honor to be here a little later in life and to join you.
Well, we like to start them young, so thank you. I want to talk about how you describe the mindset of a pilot, because you seem to be sort of a literary descendant of Antoine de Saint-Exupéry or Richard Bach, a pilot first, but one with an amazing ability to capture that experience in words. And it seems to me like you do that by simply observing, just noticing those everyday details as you fly along. And I think that's easier said than done. So what's your advice to us as pilots? How can we be more observant of the world as we're flying along?
Well, when when it came to write Skyfaring, I mean, one of the main reasons I wanted to write it was that, I grew up in addition to reading Sporties and Aviation Week, I was I was able to go up into the cockpit of airliners when we flew as a family to visit my father's family in Belgium or here within the U.S. And I really wanted to after I became a pilot, of course, that was no longer possible for young people to visit us, after departure. And I really wanted to capture the things about the job that would have made it that would have just amazed me when I was a kid, whether that's the Northern Lights or how cities look from above, which is something I talk about in Imagine a City, obviously. But so and that mindset of, what would I want to share with my younger self or with, the kids of friends or young people today is a way whether or not you write it down, I think has been a useful way of keeping the focus on that kid within all of us. And I think pilots definitely all have a very happy inner child. At least it seems most of us are pretty pleased to be able to fly if we dreamed of it when we were a kid. But of course, it's easy to forget about that as you get older, and even a job this amazing is a job, and it has you have days when you're tired or not quite feeling the joy as you once did, and so I feel like that sense of that childlike sense, whether it's something that you have your own kids or your neighbors' kids or friends have kids who think about flying, keeping that mentality has been a motivating force both for writing and for flying. The pandemic, maybe we'll talk about that. I flew throughout the pandemic, but for a lot of the time we would fly to these places and we weren't able to leave our hotel rooms. Sometimes we couldn't leave the hotel. Sometimes we couldn't even leave our room. So I had this experience of flying across the whole world to go to a city, possibly one that I wrote about in the new book, like Delhi, for example, and then we wouldn't be able to leave our hotel. And when that started to unlock, especially this spring, I remember I was in Delhi and I'd just flown in, and we stayed in a very nice hotel right by the airport. And I was tired after the flight, and I had some paperwork to catch up on, and I thought, am I gonna go all the way into town? Am I gonna get on the subway and head all the way into town? And it's hot and I'm tired, and I thought, I haven't been able to leave this hotel in Delhi for 2 years. Like, come on, get a move on, Mark. And I feel like there is that motivation to, yeah, it takes, it's like going, I think it's like exercising almost, like, that first few steps out your door to go to the gym or go for a run. It's the same for sightseeing and exploring. And I've never, I don't always manage to get myself out there, but when I do, I never regret it.
Yeah, somebody once described to me, they said that curiosity is a habit. And I think that's a simple but accurate way of describing it. It's just something that you have to sort of live day in and day out. And even as pilots, as you mentioned, sometimes you get numb to it. You've written about airplane mode, and not for your phone, but for your mind. At least that's how I read it. Um, and I think that's a great way to describe what happens. Even if I'm a passenger on an airplane, it seems like I'm more focused, or my mind operates a different way than if I'm sitting at a desk on the ground. Why do you think flying has that effect on us?
Well, the that effect of airplanes being kind of like a meditative space is, I mean, one of the ironies, of course, of being a pilot is that you don't really get a chance to enjoy that because you're busy, you've got your tasks, and you're in the cockpit, you've got a job to do. But as a passenger, I love that experience of being able to look out at the world. And I've got a number of friends who are, in the middle of pretty serious careers in the business world, and they often report to me they do their best thinking on the plane when they can't log on. I mean, I guess nowadays you usually can log on, but some of them refuse to get on the Wi-Fi because that space on a plane where you're just able to look out the window and kind of look back at your book or your notebook or your laptop is, I don't know, I don't know why it's so appealing to me. I mean, I remember when I was a kid, the first time I ever flew as a passenger by myself was also the first time I ever flew with a Walkman. And that sense of being able to listen to music and watch the world go by. And back then I wasn't writing articles, but I did have a diary, and I was very that kind of mental space where you kind of look out and look in, and I think if every journey has a purpose, and sometimes we're just flying to because we're going to a friend's wedding or something, and it's not like a major life journey for us, but many journeys are. I think of the flights that meant the most to me as a passenger. They were the ones when, um, when my father was in the hospital not long before he died, or um, our honeymoon, or that kind of thing. And those journeys are, you know, they have a beginning and an end, and they kind of seem to encapsulate a larger journey uh, in life, or to reflect larger times in our life, and that kind of space in between them, which is filled with so much so much beauty of the natural world if we're in a window seat, seems to pair well with that kind of thinking. I don't know what you think about this. Have you come across these a number of people report that they cry more when they watch a movie on board, and I don't. There was actually an article in the Atlantic about this. I don't do that, but I laugh a lot more. Like if I watch a comedy I've already seen before, I even if I've already seen it, I laugh like twice as loud as I did the first time, and I don't know what it is, but there's something about that window seat movie space. I don't know if you have any theories, or maybe some of the listeners do. But
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think it's got to be what you say, where it's almost like a meditative state. You have life, modern life is so full of distraction. And even on an airplane, as seemingly distracting as it can be back there, oftentimes it is the least distracting place in an average week. So it's got to be something like that. Either that, or it's the cabin altitude, one or the other.
one or the other. I mean, I would say even as a pilot, we are sort of over in our daily lives, we're all kind of over connected, and even when I go to work, it's a pleasure to kind of shut off my phone and just get on with a very specific task. And, it's kind of interesting because we in the cockpit of a airliner, especially like the 787, we're encased in technology, and yet it feels like a slightly older kind of journey because we are disconnected from those distractions and from the news, um, and so even as a pilot, I really enjoy that space. There's a moment where either just before or just after I walk into the cockpit, an hour before takeoff, where I just put my phone into airplane mode, and it's kind of a relief,
It,
just to kind of think I've got a task to do now, which is unrelated to what the markets are doing or what the political headlines are or anything. It's a nice feeling. I think a lot of pilots like that.
I think it's absolutely the best part and maybe the most underrated part of being a pilot. You hear great athletes or artists talk about being in a state of flow where the whole world disappears and you're just focused on that one thing you're doing. I think that is the thrill of aviation. Even Cessna 172 on a nice day, it's so all consuming that you can't help but forget about some of the day to day concerns. So
Yeah,
I
yeah.
love it, and I'm not interested in adding airplane to my or internet to my airplane anytime soon because I like that airplane mode. So let's talk about long haul flying in particular, because I think for a lot of listeners of this podcast, you can understand flying from Boston to New York or even a long trip, but there's something different about London to Hong Kong or London to Cape Town. What is the biggest difference there? What's the change when you think about long haul flying like you do?
That's an interesting question. So I flew, short haul flights on the Airbus A320 series from Heathrow, all around Europe. Our shortest flights were, I don't know, 30 minutes to Amsterdam or Brussels, and our longest ones were, coming up to 4 hours to go to Istanbul or Tripoli or places like that. I mean, the biggest difference. I mean, there's a lot of, Europe is obviously a very heavily controlled, air traffic environment. Once you know, once you start crossing oceans, you end up having different procedures, obviously different communication procedures, different contingency procedures. I started on the 747, which is doesn't require any TOPS certification because it's obviously four engines. But for the 787, which I fly now, of course, ETOPS is another consideration. I think almost the most remarkable sensation that I had when I started to fly long haul, which is more about what we see outside. When you fly in when you fly in the northeast of the U.S. or anywhere in Western Europe, the world looks pretty populated, um, and obviously the population pressures of the world. We all know that those are having effects on the environment that we have to work on, but nevertheless, when you fly long haul, you really do get this a sense of a world that seems almost empty for hours and hours on end. So when you fly over the oceans, obviously, but when you fly over Siberia or over the Sahara or Australia, I just came back from Australia, which we flew to from Singapore. So we flew from one end of Australia to the other, and there's a lot of emptiness. I mean, Canada basically, from within 100 miles of the U.S. border on north, um, is that alone would be one of the largest countries in the world, and essentially, and there are very, very few people there, and there's very little evidence from above, especially from cruising altitude, from an airliner's cruising altitude, of that, of any human uh, signs of, there's very few lights at night, sometimes no lights at all for an hour or more. I think this was in, I don't know if this is in Imagine a City or in Skyfaring, but there's a statistic that somebody came up with about what percentage of the world you could survive on unclothed for 24 hours. Um, and we think of Earth as this, a pretty obviously it's a pretty, for us, it's a pretty mild planet. We grew up on it as a species. We think of it as green and all that, but you rule out the oceans, so that's 2/3, and then you rule out the deserts and the far north, at least in winter, and you're not. I think it was something like 10% of the world's surface is kind of really amenable to us as a species, and that's not a sense you get on short haul flying in a densely populated part of the world. But once you switch to long haul, the overwhelming impression is of emptiness and very long distances between places.
Yeah, that's particularly powerful, I think, in a small airplane. If you're even just in the U.S. flying out west in a single engine airplane, sometimes you look awfully hard at that desert below and think about what you're really flying over. But let's
Yeah, I did my VFR flying. I did most of my training in the UK, but I did my VFR training in Phoenix, like so many pilots do from the US and from all around the world. And Phoenix is a big city, uh, just in terms of its its physical extent as well as its population, but it doesn't take very long to leave that behind and suddenly look down on a lot of uninhabited land, which is wonderful. It's a wonderful thing to see and to fly over.
Let's talk about the other end of the spectrum from that single engine, which is the 747. You mentioned you flew that. You now fly the 787. Both pretty iconic airplanes, but pretty different in their history and what kind of airplane they are. Can you describe the unique personalities of those two airplanes?
I mean, the 747 was needs no introduction really. Like many kids, I was just obsessed with it. I had model airplanes in my room, and most of them were 747s. It was just the plane that if you take its role in sort of culture and in American history, that's the role it had in me as a kid. Just that sense that this is the plane that will take you anywhere. That it's and it really did change the world. It made long haul travel a possibility for the sort of global middle class. It made it inexpensive in a way that previous airplanes hadn't. And I often think whether when we look back, will we really think it was on the 20th century? We think of globalization as really being a function of the computer and stuff. But before that, and perhaps even more importantly, it was airplanes that made that connection possible. In particular, for people to go places and for goods to go places, and the 747 was so attached to that. In terms of flying it, it was a joy to fly. You mentioned a Cessna. I remember one of my instructors on my conversion course. He said, "Mark, it's just a big Cessna. It's just a big Cessna, but it's a very big Cessna." Um, and and the I think the most striking sense coming to it from the Airbus was of the remoteness of the cockpit. I mean, you go up the stairs and through the upper deck to reach this. The cockpit, which is isolated at the front of the plane, but also above most of the passengers. I remember my first flight on it was to Hong Kong, and we boarded obviously before the passengers, and it was, to me, it felt like a little bit of a rush, because it was my first time. Obviously, for the training captain and the extra pilots, it was old hat. But an hour after we walked onto the airplane, the dispatcher came up and said everybody's on board, and I hadn't seen a single passenger.
Wow.
I hadn't seen a single one, and he said, total passengers tonight 335 or whatever, and off we went. And you're remote even from the landing gear. I mean, when I came onto the 787 the first time I was flying it, and we lowered the landing gear, the noise of the landing gear, its physical proximity to you, and the gear obviously produces a lot of air noise, and that on the 747, when you lowered the gear, you had this sort of you could kind of hear it, and you could feel, obviously you could feel the drag, but it was really something you felt more than you heard. Whereas on the Airbus or the 787, where you're so close to the gear, it's suddenly like you're like, oh wow, those wheels are right below us. But in other ways, the 787, obviously it has a lot of very friendly features. It has a head-up display, which is a joy to use. I had never flown an airplane with one before. It's the cockpit itself, despite when the gear is up, at least is extremely quiet. Over the ocean, sometimes we take off our headsets and just use the cockpit speakers, and if you pass another airplane 1,000 feet above or below you, you can hear that other airplane from inside the cockpit,
Wow.
which with your ears uncovered, which is saying something. Um, there's lots of little small details that you kind of realize are advancements. The 747s, all of its cockpit lighting were these kind of old incandescent bulbs that were quite yellowish, and you could almost imagine if you were flying somewhere on a snowy or rainy night, it almost felt like you were at sea in some ways. If you were into old stories of sailors and mariners and stuff, it felt you could kind of imagine that that you had something in common with sailors. And of course, the 747 was seen as an ocean liner of the skies. I mean, it was marketed that way. The 787 has this very, very white LED light. I guess it's LED lighting, which I kind of more associate with the dentist's office or something. I mean, it's it's very pure, very white light, but it's not something you'd want in your home. So lots of little small differences like that. The 747, it had a bathroom, a toilet in the cockpit, and the bunks were also in the cockpit, so you could have this entire existence on a 14-hour flight. You never really needed to leave the flight deck. And if you were in the bunk on a trip with extra crew and you wanted to go brush your teeth or go to the bathroom, you could just walk out in your pajamas and and never see a passenger. On the 787, the bunks are accessed through the passenger cabin, and they're obviously updated and nicer. And there's actually a seat there with a screen, so you can watch a movie if you're not sleeping on a daytime flight, maybe. But of course, the 747 bunks were preferred by some pilots, I guess. And then there's just I was talking a minute ago about the environment. There's just the straightforward fact that the 787 is a much more efficient airplane. I think per passenger it's about a third more efficient. But we use these straightforward rule of thumbs for fuel consumption. And on the 747, that was 10 metric tons an hour was the sort of baseline cruise figure. And on the 787, it's half that. It's 5 tons. Obviously, the 747 carried more people, but it didn't carry twice as many. So that those efficiencies are very very clear, and it feels good to be flying that newer plane.
Mark, let's take a quick break, and when we come back, let's talk about cities a little bit.
Sure.
Earn your pilot's license, get current, or add a rating. No matter what your goal is, Sporty's pilot training app will save you time and money. It's available on all your devices, including iPad, iPhone, Android, and smart TVs, so you can access Sporty's award-winning courses anywhere. Plus, with up-to-date sync between platforms and free lifetime updates, you'll always be up to date. Over 25 courses are available, from private pilot to aerobatics. Visit sportys.com/discover for a free trial. Now, back to Pilot's Discretion.
We are back with Mark Vanhoenacker. And Mark, your latest book, Imagine a City, you take the reader on a tour of dozens of cities around the world, once again with your sharp eye for detail, I think. So what's your secret for exploring a city you've never been to? You mentioned earlier, going to Delhi and should I go into town? If you've landed, you've got 24 hours. What's sort of your method for attacking a new city?
One of the things that's really special about exploring cities as a pilot, and this is really what I wanted to capture in Imagine a City almost more than anything else, was when you go to a city as a business traveler. I used to work in the business world. You've got meetings, and you've got like socializing in the evening maybe, and maybe you're only in a city for 36 hours and then you fly off somewhere else, and you don't really see a lot of the city. And if you're a tourist and you go somewhere, you may never go to that city again. If you go to Delhi, maybe it's a once in a lifetime trip. It probably is for most people. So you've got a list of things you want to get done, and quite reasonably you want to pack in as much as you can. But for pilots, we go back to cities again and again, and we don't really have any tasks after we land except to be rested for the flight home. And that allows you to really be relaxed about your explorations, and to kind of not necessarily do the touristy things, but you do those touristy things, but you don't have to rush to do them, and you might say you're going to do them on your next trip. I remember the first time I went to Beijing on the 747, and several of my colleagues were going up to see the Great Wall, and I'd never been to Beijing before. I'd never been to China before, and of course, who wouldn't want to see the Great Wall? But I knew that on that trip, I already knew that a few weeks later, I was coming back to Beijing. So I thought, well, I'll do the Great Wall next time, and this time I'm just going to walk. So I just kind of walked around the city, and found some lunch and a coffee shop, and just kind of got a sense of the place without any pressure. And that's a really unique sense, I think, and that builds over time. I mean, when I went to the 747 used to fly to Los Angeles. We used to have 3 flights a day there, so I went there once a month or something for years. And then we stopped going there for a while, and we started going again on the 747. I thought, oh, I wonder how many times I've been to LA, and I thought it was like 25 or 30. It was like 60 times. And I have a few friends there from college, and I have cafes I go to and hikes I go to and bike rides I like, and you can kind of almost forget you're not from a place because you end up with this unique kind of perspective. I mean, I would say that one of the best things, one of the things that's most useful for exploring a city is a really good subway system, and Delhi is a great example of that. When I first started going there, the subway system was very new and wasn't really built out. And Delhi, like a lot of really big Indian cities, is it can be a little intimidating if you don't really know where to go, and you're not sure even how to cross streets, which can sometimes seem perilous in Delhi. And so you tend to be maybe a little more conservative. But I find a city with a good subway system really allows you just to, like Delhi's system is now much more extensive and much takes you to all sorts of places it didn't used to, and that sense that you can kind of just kind of walk and walk and walk until you decide you're done, and then when you are, you can just go to the nearest subway station, and then once you're in that network, that almost kind of virtual space that subway systems provide, where you can just follow one line and then get back to where you started or where you need to be next. I think that's a really, really useful. That's a really useful way to be a little more adventurous than we might otherwise be. And of course, as pilots, we do need to be back in time for our flight, and so subways make that a little easier in cities that are very traffic prone. I remember the story of in Cape Town, which is one of my favorite cities when I flew the 747. There, the sort of the largest attraction in every sense there is Table Mountain, which is this 3,300 or so foot mountain that towers above the city, and you can either climb up there if you're up for a hike, or you can take the iconic cable car up. And that cable car closes actually if the winds get too strong. And years and years ago, one of my colleagues went up to the top of Table Mountain, and then they closed the cable car because of the winds, and he had to fly back that night to London. So he had to call from a phone booth and call someone in the operations center in London and say, look, it's looking a little close on my time here. In the end, he did make it down, but that's a good example of maybe not being too adventurous when you're on the clock.
I think one of the great ways you describe cities in the book is flying over a city at night, and you say it looks like a circuit, which I had never thought of that, but absolutely clicked as soon as I read that, because it really does look that way, the streets and everything connecting. What is, do you think, the most memorable or most interesting approach to a city at night from the air?
Oh, that's a really tough question. I mean, imagine a city is not really it's in some ways it's a book about flying, in other ways it's more about the places we go to. But I do talk a bunch of times about some of my favorite approaches in there, and London, like Heathrow, my home base. Obviously, flying in there is an amazing journey. I've seen it, I don't know, thousands of times, I guess, but I never get tired of it. Especially if you're landing to the west on 27 left or 27 right. I strongly recommend you get a window seat on the right hand side of your whatever plane you're flying there, and you fly right along the Thames, flying sort of up the Thames, and you pass every major site in London that you would like. Whatever the TripAdvisor's top 25 sites are in London, you'll see every one of them from above. If it's clear, of course, which isn't always clear in London. But in some ways, I think my favorite city to fly into is Los Angeles, which will be familiar to many of your listeners. And it is just the sprawl of the city is incredible, and its brightness. And I think researchers of like AI and stuff often talk about emergent qualities, like these qualities that come about not because they're necessarily planned, but because they're a function of the complexity that's not quite planned and not quite organic either. And I think cities are a really good example of that. And Los Angeles is a visually very, very vivid example of it. The scale of the city, stretching all the way from the mountains to the ocean, and its brightness, and of course the fact that you come to it if you've come there from London, you've flown over Scotland and Greenland and the Arctic and Canada and some pretty empty parts of the Midwest and the Rockies and then the Mojave Desert, and then suddenly, right before the ocean is this glittering metropolis. There's a line in Imagine a City which I took from Eleanor Roosevelt where she talked about, she was flying there I guess in 1945. I think maybe she had a relative who lived in Pasadena. I think that's why she was going. Anyways, and she talks about flying in and Los Angeles being this looking like a handful of jewels scattered over the desert, glowing, just glowing up at night. And that was in 1945. God knows what she'd make of how it looks now. And of course, there's the name. In Imagine a City, I talk about the names of cities. And Los Angeles I grew up in New England. California was kind of this shining place, even though we'd never been there. And Los Angeles is a great name for a city, and it has it had an iconic role in my imagination as a kid, and it still does to me now as a pilot who flies there, even one who flies there so often.
All right, Mark, at the end of every one of these episodes, we do a lightning round, what we call ready to copy. I'll ask some questions on a wide variety of topics. You give me your quick answer. I have dozens of these, so we'll see how many we get to. Are you ready to copy?
Sure, yeah.
What did you learn as a management consultant that serves you well as a pilot?
I learned that if you spend hours in the window seat of your office playing Flight Simulator, then you're probably in the wrong job.
Do you enjoy flying more or traveling more?
Oh gosh, that's a tough one. That's like a journey versus destination one, isn't it? I'm gonna say, as much as I like flying, I like getting somewhere as well. So I'm gonna go with the destination on that one.
All right, as an airline pilot, what is the best overnight destination?
Oh gosh, that's a tough one. Tokyo. It's my favorite city. Tokyo. It's the ultimate city.
You coined a phrase, aero-ease, which you call the international language of pilots, more than just the pilot controller glossary. So what's your favorite word in aero-ease?
Oh, wow. These are tough questions. Wow. Wilco, I think, is the best one for will comply. I love that. And I've introduced it to some friends. Actually, no, I'm going to revise my answer. Decide. Decide is the best call. The decide call that's automated on many airplanes. I think Airbuses say minimums, but Boeing still give you a nice clear decide, and that's a great thing to have in life. Like, it's time to decide.
It's a good one, although I'd back you up on wilco. I occasionally say that to family members and get strange looks when I say wilco.
Many of your listeners can relate, I'm sure.
Where's the best place for plane spotting? Is it the in and out at LAX, or is there somewhere else?
Yeah, I mean, the in and out is I'm gonna just weather wise and food wise. If you want to not get rained on, have a great meal and see a lot of really interesting planes, it's got to be the in and out by LAX.
How much of your life is a checklist, either an actual one or a mental one? Do you take the checklist mentality outside the cockpit?
Almost. I'm crippled by checklists. My life is, I have checklists of checklists. So yes, it's mostly checklists.
Some airline pilots seem to love the experience after thousands of hours. Some of them seem to get burned out. So what is your best tip for staying interested and excited about flying once it becomes routine?
Think about how your 14-year-old self would be amazed.
Who is your favorite aviation author?
Oh, that's a tough one. Out of Africa is not really a book about flying, but it has some amazing passages about flying. I think my favorite passages of flying in any book. But I'm gonna probably go with Ernst Gann and Fate as a Hunter. I think it's an amazing book. It's so much of it is different, and so much of it just hasn't changed at all. So that's a great book for anyone who loves flying, especially if you're aspiring to possibly a career as a pilot.
Underrated or overrated? Pittsfield's most famous resident, Herman Melville.
Underrated.
And is Moby Dick the right book, or is there another one we should read?
Moby Dick's a great one. He was traveling obviously decades before aviation was invented, but that sense of exploration and of wonder and of geographic journeys and how they kind of map onto our own personal stories and the journey that's the life. I think it's a great one.
What air is the best architecture in Brasilia?
Oh, well, the Congress, I think the Congress Hall that's at the east end. I think it's at the east end of the main mall there. I think is I'm going to go with that.
Great section in Imagine a City. For listeners, if you haven't read the book, that part may sound like that's a question out of left field, but it's a great part of the book.
And I would say anyone who's interested in Brasilia, just look at a picture, a satellite photo or whatever of Brasilia at night. It looks like an airplane, and that was intentional, which is the best reason to visit a city, maybe.
You studied East African history in school. So if I'm going to go spend a week in East Africa, where should I go?
I would go to Zanzibar, which is the island, now part of Tanzania, just off the coast, and it's just an amazing mix of cultures and landscapes. And it was a trading state. It was a very important place between places, and it's a destination in its own right. So I'll go with Zanzibar.
Do you think you have a separate pilot's brain and writer's brain, or are they actually the same?
Oh, that's a good one. I think they, for the most part, they use different parts of the brain, and that's a great thing. I think that's why they pair so well. Why so many pilots end up writing, whether it's for themselves or their family stories or books. I think they pair. They're very different, but they pair well.
Our last question is always the same. You have one final flight. We want to know, what are you flying and where are you going?
So I'm flying from London to Cape Town on a 747 with my 330 closest friends on board. That was my last flight on the 747 was to Cape Town. I didn't have any friends on board, sadly, but yeah, it's just an iconic journey. Cape Town is a city that is an amazing place for any traveler, but to cross such a large distance in so many different places to reach it is an experience like no other. And I'm glad it was my last flight on 747.
Mark, thanks for being on the podcast.
Oh, thanks, John. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Pilot's Discretion, brought to you by Sporties, training and equipping pilots worldwide for over 60 years. For more episodes and helpful links, visit sporties.com/podcast. And if you have comments or guest ideas, email podcast@sporties.com. I'm John Zimmerman. We'll see you next time on Pilot's Discretion.